Wapananda, thank you for joining me again today. This is the Friday on which I would normally be telling you about our regular 3-week review of the coronavirus regulations and explaining whether we have any headroom to make any changes to the rules. But as I explained last Friday, we have already decided not to make any changes to the restrictions in this 3-week cycle because of the spread of the Delta variant here in Wales and across the UK. Today I will set out the very latest public health situation in Wales and what this might mean for us over the next couple of weeks. Now, I said last week that we were beginning to face a serious situation once again in Wales. And since then, the Delta variant has continued to spread quickly. It has moved rapidly beyond the 3 clusters which had developed in South East Wales and in Conwy in the north, and is now spreading freely in communities right across Wales. Last Friday, there were just under 500 confirmed cases of the Delta variant. Today, the very latest available figures show that that number has more than doubled, that there are around 1,100 cases now in Wales and that number is rising. The All Wales coronavirus case rate is also rising, driven by the Delta variant. Today, we're up to 37 cases per 100,000 people across Wales. That number is highest in the north, where 4 of the 6 local authority areas have rates higher than 50 cases per 100,000 of their population. And as many as 97% of new cases of coronavirus in North Wales are caused by the Delta variant. The positivity rate is also continuing to rise. It now stands at 2.9% across Wales as a whole, but is as high as 7.2% in Flintshire. The very latest information I have is that 15 people have now been admitted to hospital having contracted the Delta variant in Wales. Now, fortunately, these numbers remain low at the moment, but we have to be prepared to see them rise, just as they have been rising in England and in Scotland. We continue to be about 2 to 3 weeks behind what is happening elsewhere in the United Kingdom. And what is happening elsewhere can give us valuable information about how the variant will behave here in Wales. England and Scotland have seen several weeks now of rapid growth in cases of the Delta variant. The latest figures show that there are now more than 102,000 cases of the Delta variant in England, and that number continues to rise. If we see similar growth here in Wales, then our services will come under pressure here once again. Our TTP system is already dealing with rising numbers of cases. Coronavirus is once again affecting our schools and our care homes. Now, all this means that all the things we can do in our own lives to keep ourselves safe become even more important. Hand washing, keeping our distance, wearing a face covering, working from home, keeping indoor spaces ventilated, avoiding unnecessary foreign travel. These matter most of all in helping us change the risk of falling so ill that hospital treatment is the only answer. Now, you will see from the graph that has just gone on the screen what has been happening in relation to hospital admissions for coronavirus across the UK since the spring. In fact, apologies, that is not the slide that you are seeing. We have 2 slides for you today. And we'll see whether we can get the... Right, that's the slide I was referring to. So this is the slide that shows how the daily number of patients admitted to hospital across the UK is rising again. You see how high it was back at the start of March. It falls rapidly as things improved, and then from the middle of May you see that pattern beginning to rise again. And the fact that we see that across the United Kingdom means that we have to expect that it will begin to happen here in Wales as well. Now, the evidence suggests that the Delta variant is somewhere between 40 and 80% more transmissible than the Alpha variant, also known as the Kent variant, which was responsible for the majority of cases during the last peak in the winter. We've been working, as we have throughout the pandemic, with Swansea University to model what could happen next in Wales. And the latest model suggests that cases are likely to peak late next month. In previous waves, there's always been a lag between infections in the community and an increase in hospitalisations and deaths. If this wave follows the same pattern, then the model says that we can expect to see hospitalisations and deaths peaking in August. What we don't know yet is what impact our high rates of vaccination will have, and how much the relationship between infections on the one hand and hospitalisations on the other has been weakened by vaccination. The increases in cases of the variant in England have been highest amongst younger people who have not yet been vaccinated and who tend to have more contact with more other people. And here too in Wales, we're beginning to see a similar pattern emerge. Now here is the slide you started to see before, but it's a slide that tells us the difference in the rise in the rate of confirmed cases in different parts of the population. As you can see in the red line, cases amongst people aged 60 and over are either static or rising very marginally. The rise in cases amongst people under 25, the blue line, is accelerating much faster. And that tells us that here in Wales, some of the same patterns that we have seen elsewhere in the United Kingdom and which we saw in Wales during the first two waves is emerging once again. That gap between the age groups in numerical terms looks like this. For people under 25, the all Wales rate is around 67 cases per 100,000 people in the population, and for 67 cases for people aged under 25, but just 9 cases for people aged over 60. And in North Wales, where the cases are at their highest, the rates are more than 7 times higher for people under 25 in Flintshire than for those over 60. Now, what this may be telling us, and I must say it is suggestive, it's what may be showing rather than being sure about it, is that we're seeing the positive impact of the vaccination programme in slowing down the spread of the virus across the age ranges. And that's because more than 9 out of 10 people aged over 65, with healthcare staff and people living in older people's care homes in Wales, all of those people have already had 2 doses of the vaccine, more than 9 out of 10 of them. More than 85% of people between the ages of 55 and 64 have been doubly vaccinated. And there is that positive research evidence emerging that despite the speed at which the Delta variant is spreading, vaccination is helping to prevent serious illnesses. And that is why, of course, we are working so hard to focus our vaccination programme on getting as many people as possible to have 2 doses of the vaccine during the 4 weeks in which we have paused any further changes to restrictions. Take-up rates in Wales have been fantastic, and overall people have been really enthusiastic about the vaccine. We're seeing some small signs now, though, of hesitancy, lower numbers coming forward in people in the age 30 to 39. Health boards are working hard to make clinics and appointments as flexible as possible, as close to people's homes and work as possible, and it's very important, I think, that employers give staff the time off they need to go and be vaccinated when they are invited to be so. We also continue to work with particular communities and groups to maximise their protection, to make sure that nobody in Wales is left behind and that everybody in Wales is able to say yes to the vaccine. One dose, we know, is not enough to give you the protection which this vaccine can provide. We need everyone to complete the 2-dose course to make sure we all get the full protection the vaccine offers. So please, keep on saying yes to vaccination and keep that appointment when it comes to you. Diolch o galon I chi gyd. I'll turn now to take questions as usual from journalists, and all the answers will be broadcast on the Welsh Government's own social media platforms. And this afternoon, the first person is to go to Teleri Glyn Jones at BBC Wales.
And da, Prif Weinidog, diolch yn fawr iawn. If we can have both answers to both questions in Welsh as well, please, we'd appreciate it. So, how will Wales look in your mind when everyone in the adult population is double vaccinated? What will the restrictions look like?
Well, when everybody has had 2 doses of the vaccine, we will have a much clearer understanding of the relationship between vaccination and falling ill and hospitalisation. So let us just for a moment take an optimistic view, because insofar as we can understand the data at the moment, it is looking a bit more optimistic. At that point, the things that we would have restored at level 1 will have been restored. People will be able to meet indoors in larger numbers. We will have been able to reopen some further parts of the Welsh economy. People will be able to mix in greater numbers. And we may, and this is more provisional, I think, we may be moving away from the mandation of those very important actions we all take in our own lives and continue to advise people to abide by them. So I think that is where we might be able to get to when everybody has had the 2 doses and when we are confident that double dosing really does protect people from falling ill on the one hand and certainly being so ill that they need a hospital bed on the other. So pan ni'n cyrraedd at y pwynt ble mae pob un ohonon ni wedi cael ar 2 dos o'r brechlyn, byddwn ni'n fwy ymwybodol am yr effaith mae hwn yn mynd I gael ar y perthynas rhwng compon dost ar un llaw ac y nifer y bobl sy'n mor dost bydd rhaid iddyn nhw cael triniaeth yn yr ysbytai ar yr ochr arall. Am funed os ni'n feddwl am hwnna mewn ffordd optimistig, dyn ni ddim yn gwybod yn digon a hyn o bryd, ond y tystiolaeth yn dangos rai pethau yn optimistig. Os mae'n y brechlyn yn mynd I cael effaith positif ar y perthynas rhwng cwmpon dost a mynd i'r ysbyty, allai I weld popeth oeddwn ni gallu wneud ar lefel 1 o'r cyfyngiadau sydd 'da ni yn ei le, fwy o bobl gallu gwneud pethau dan do, fwy o bobl gallu cwrdd â gilydd, fwy o busnesau wedi ail agor, ac y posibiliad yw o troi popeth ni'n wneud a pethau pwysig ni'n wneud, pethau cymdeithasol, golchi dwylo yn y blaen, I troi hwnna mas o'r gyfraith, ble maen nhw heddi, i'r pethau ni'n gallu ofyn I bobl I wneud, ond nid yn orfodol.
So if we haven't seen a significant rise in hospitalisations and deaths at that point, can we expect to see restrictions lifted completely, or to a certain extent? We've had a date in England and now in Scotland. Are you going to be able to give us a date here in Wales?
Well, you've had a plethora of dates in England. And I'm afraid that just demonstrates, the limitations of that approach to dealing with the virus. That you set out dates which you then cannot achieve. And I've never been attracted to that way of doing things here in Wales. We have stuck throughout to our 3-week cycle. So it's never long before I'm back here again telling people what the latest position will be. And that's how we intend to carry on doing things. If everything moves in the positive direction, then we will go on lifting the restrictions, the remaining restrictions that there are in people's lives in Wales. But neither I, nor the Prime Minister, nor anybody else knows what the position in 3 weeks' time will be. As you've heard me say, the Delta variant is rising and rising rapidly. There are other variants in other parts of the world which we continue to be concerned about. So there's no guarantee that things will be better in 3 weeks' time, although we remain hopeful that they will be. And that's why it is more sensible not to set, as I see them, artificial dates that you then have to tear up and start all over again, but to stick to the rhythm that people in Wales have got used to. Every 3 weeks, we sum up the position. Every 3 weeks, we report on them. And we always approach that in the hope that we will be able to go on restoring freedoms to people in the different parts of their lives. Wel, ni wedi weld beth sydd wedi digwydd dros y ffin yn yr Alban, ble maen nhw wedi rhoi dyddiadau lawr, ond pan maen nhw'n gyrraedd at y dyddiadau, dydyn nhw ddim yn gallu gwneud beth oedden nhw'n addo wneud. A dwi ddim yn eisiau gwneud fel na yma yng Nghymru. Dyn ni wedi osgoi wneud fel na dros y cyfnod o coronavirus i gyd. Bob tair wythnos dwi'n dod fan hyn, bob tair wythnos ni'n edrych ar y tystiolaeth, weld ble mae lle da ni i cario ymlaen i llacio cyfyngiadau, ond ni'n neud yn y cyd-destun y tystiolaeth, y data bob tro. A achos ni'n neud bob tair wythnos, does dim amser hir i bobl aros i ni bwydo nôl am y sefyllfa yma yng Nghymru. A bob tro ni'n mynd ati i weld ble allwn ni roi fwy o ryddid nôl i bobl, ond ni'n neud yn y cyd-destun ar y pryd, ac fel mae wedi bod dros y cyfnod o'r a'r argyfwng i gyd, mae'n amhosibl i ddweud heddi beth bydd y sefyllfa mewn wythnosau sydd i ddod, fel dwi wedi trial i esbonio pan oedd ni'n setio mas a sefyllfa a hyn o bryd gyda'r amrywiolyn Delta. Teleri, diolch yn fawr. Over to Mike Griffiths at ITV Wales.
Hello, good afternoon, First Minister. My first question would be, with the modelling and the data that we have currently available to us, notwithstanding the fact that we have a few weeks before the next review, how confident are you with the peak forecast for late next month that we will be able to complete the move to level 1?
Well, first of all, I think the modelling that Swansea University has done for us has turned out to be, remarkably reliable during the pandemic, and indeed, I know other parts of the United Kingdom are relying on the work that Swansea does as a result of that level of sophistication in what they call the most likely scenario. Between June and the end of August, they are predicting around 900 extra hospital admissions as a result of the Delta variant. So that is not a small number of additional cases at a time when the health service is trying to recover the ground of all the things that it hasn't been able to do, and a reasonable worst case scenario has that number significantly higher than 900. So if it is at the lower end, then I think we will be in a position to think about continuing to restore freedoms to people, but there's no guarantee that it will be. And there are circumstances, if the variant was more transmissible, if vaccination was less of a safeguard against it, then those numbers could be much higher and we'd be in a more difficult position to go on lifting the restrictions, the remaining restrictions. You know, we've lifted the bulk of restrictions already in Wales. We're at the further end of lifting them, and it will be harder to go on doing that if things were at the worst end of what might happen. At the better end, and that's the most likely scenario, then I think there is a prospect we can carry on.
Thank you very much. Now, picking up on what was said at the last review, the pilot system of live events, for example, a number have been held. More are due to happen over the summer months. Can you tell us more on that and what has actually been learnt so far, data-wise, that's informing the decisions and hopefully will see them becoming more widespread?
Yes, Mike, thank you very much. So, despite the fact that we have had to pause the general lifting of restrictions, we've been keen to be able to press ahead with our pilot programme because it is designed now to show us how we can safely accommodate larger numbers of people at arts venues, sporting venues and in festivals. So we are learning a great deal. We're learning about ways in which the venues themselves can be safely organised. We're learning about what is the useful role for lateral flow testing as a condition of admission to those events. We're learning about the training that is needed for people who staff those events. You know, they need to be as well prepared and equipped as they can be to help people to continue to behave safely. We're learning a lot about how people behave, not in the ground or the venue itself, but on the way to the event and on the way home from the event, and things we might need to put in place to help people to be able to deal with that part of the whole experience in a way that is safe for themselves. So we're learning as well about the role of local authority enforcement staff, how we can make sure that that is also available in the numbers and with the nature that is required. So you can see there's a lot to learn, and it's why the pilot scheme is worth going on for, because there's still more that we can draw from it to do exactly what you said, to try to be able to have more of these events with more people being able to attend, provided it can be done in ways that people are confident that everything is in its place to help to keep them safe. Mike, thank you very much. Over to Hannah Thomas at LBC.
Thank you, First Minister. We've spoken to Ice Arena Wales, who have to date lost £500,000 being closed throughout this pandemic. They still don't have a date to reopen, and they don't understand why they've been grouped with nightclubs when they are closer to leisure centres and have to watch daily as the leisure centre beside them has queues around the block of people wanting to have a swim while they remain closed. What work is being done to reopen them?
Well, there is a reason why ice rinks have not been reopened. We looked very carefully at this as a cabinet a week ago, and very specifically at ice rinks, and once again received advice from our Chief Medical Officer and Chief Scientist about the particular dangers that are posed in those very cold and enclosed environments. There was a proper debate as to whether or not this is the right moment to reopen. We only have 2 ice rinks of that sort in Wales, and the one in North Wales is being used for alternative purposes at the moment. But in the end, the advice was this was not the moment to do so. We continue to be in conversation with the sector about whether it would be possible for the ice rink to be open for professional sporting purposes only, rather than for general public use. And the reason why it's possible to open one place rather than another is because the risks are different. Now, our advisors continue to look at evidence from around the world about it, and I hope that we will be in a position, if things continue on the path we'd like them to be on, to be able to reopen ice rinks as well. But we won't do it when the advice to us from our most senior advisors is that this isn't the moment to do so.
Thank you, First Minister. My next question is about the story circulating Matt Hancock today. If Wales's Health Minister was caught breaching social distancing guidelines through an alleged affair, would you expect that minister to resign?
Well, look, let me say first of all that I think there is a legitimate distinction to be drawn between what people do in their private lives and what they do in their public lives. And I'm not trying to make points about what people do as entirely private matters. But in the case of Mr. Hancock, it does seem to me that there are some issues that are of genuine public interest. I do think there are questions that need to be answered about whether those rules were broken, the social distancing rules. Mr. Hancock himself was very quick to condemn a senior academic from Imperial College when he was found breaching those rules. So I think there are questions, legitimate public interest questions to answer there. And I think there are legitimate public interest questions to be answered about how individuals are appointed if they turn out to be in a different sort of relationship with the minister who is responsible for their appointment. Certainly here in Wales, I always expect the whole of our ministerial team to observe the rules that we expect other people to observe. You can't make laws for other people and then not be willing to abide by them yourself. Hannah, thank you very much. Draw I Lowry Roberts, newyddion.
Helo, diolch Prif Weinidog. Cwestiwn am yr euros a'r pêl-droed sydd gen i. Yn naturiol, diogelwch y cyhoedd sydd bwysicaf, ond ydych chi fel Llywodraeth a chi fel Prif Weinidog wedi gwneud unrhyw ymgais i gael rhai cefnogwyr pêl-droed Cymru sydd wedi cael 2 frechiad i deithio i rhai o gemau'r euros?
Wel, diolch yn fawr. Lawr i na, dwi ni ddim wedi wneud. Hynny, mae cyngor yr Llywodraeth fan hyn wedi bod yn glir am wythnosau. Lot yn well i aros fan hyn yng Nghymru ac yn fwynhau y gemau fan hyn, ble mae pobl yn gallu cadw yn ddiogel, a dwi'n diolchgar dros ben i'r nifer fawr o bobl yng Nghymru, gyda diddordeb mawr i weld y gêm yn personol, ond yn wedi wneud y penderfyniad i cefnogi'r tîm gytre. Ni'n gwybod mae pobl o Gymru ddim yn gallu mynd mewn i'r iseldiroedd i weld y gêm lot yn well, cefnogi'r tîm, cefnogi'r tîm yn llawn wrth cwrs, ond wneud e mewn ffordd sy'n cadw ni i gyd yn ddiogel. Hannah's asking me, I beg your pardon, Lowry's asking me if we've made any representations to allow people who've been doubly vaccinated to go to watch games that Wales is playing in elsewhere in Europe, and I simply explained that our advice has been clear from the very beginning. Same advice as the FAW, same advice as the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. The safe way to enjoy the football and to support the Welsh team is to do it from home, and I'm hugely grateful to those thousands and thousands of people who would dearly loved to have travelled and to have watched the game live, who've made the decision to support the team as strongly as we would all wish to do, but to do it in a way that keeps themselves and everybody else safe, and that remains the advice of the Welsh Government.
Ac jyst i ddim ymlaen arna, ydych chi'n deall rhwystredigaeth y cefnogwyr felly sydd ddim wedi gallu teithio, ystyried fod cefnogwyr o Denmark er enghraifft yn gallu teithio i Amsterdam am hyn a hyn o oriau yn unig?
Wel, wrth cwrs dwi'n gallu weld pa mae pobl yn teimlo'n ffrwystredig, yn gallu weld beth mae pobl eraill yn gallu wneud. Dyn ni ddim fel gwlad, fel Dynes Unedig, dyn ni ddim yn yr un sefyllfa. Berthynas rhwng Denmark a'r iseldiroedd yw rhywbeth wahanol. A mae'r pobl yn yr iseldiroedd wedi bod yn glir am hynny. Ond allai i weld pa mae pobl yn teimlo fel yna. Wrth cwrs, dyna pam dwi'n mor ddiolchgar i bobl sy'n wedi wneud y penderfyniad ar ôl teimlo fel yna i wneud beth am fy marn ni yn wneud popeth ni'n gallu wneud i cadw Cymru i gyd yn ddiogel. So Lowry was asking me if I understand the frustration of people who really want to go and watch the football, and particularly when they can see fans from Denmark able to travel to Holland if they stay there only for a limited number of hours. And I was just explaining that I absolutely understand that sense of frustration. The relationship between Denmark and Holland is a different one between the United Kingdom and Holland, and the authorities in Holland have been clear that they would not be prepared to allow fans from Wales to attend those games. But it is why I remain particularly grateful to those thousands and thousands of people who do feel deeply frustrated, but nevertheless make the decision to do what they can to help to keep Wales safe. And this year, sadly, but I think genuinely, that decision is best made to stay at home and support Wales from Wales. Diolch yn fawr, Lowry. Over to Adam Hale at PA.
Prif Weinidog, there's been talk that UK government ministers are considering quarantine exemptions for people travelling to particular countries if they're fully vaccinated. If that goes ahead, would you oppose such change in rules for Welsh passengers, or would you reluctantly accept it?
Well, Adam, you are right. There has been talk. But what there hasn't been is any firm proposal and no sharing as yet of the evidence that will be drawn upon in making such a decision. So, here I think is another one of those examples that we have seen throughout the pandemic. Sometimes the UK government making decisions for England seems to me to make a headline announcement first and then work out the detail of what lies behind it. Whereas in Wales, we have always tried to work on the detail first, and when we're sure about what we're doing, then to make the announcement. And that is what we will do in this area as well. When the evidence is made available to us as to the extent to which double vaccination would be a substitute for quarantine and other measures, we will assess it and we will make the decision for Wales. At the moment, I genuinely don't think we know enough about what is actually proposed for England, the timescale against which any such moves might be made, and the data, the science and the information that they will be relying upon to have come to that conclusion.
Thank you. You say the modelling suggests cases here are likely to peak late next month. What are the chances of you delaying any significant easing of restrictions until a further 4 weeks after that peak to see what sort of pressure is put on the services?
Well, I have been told, and I know that SAGE has provided the same advice to the UK government, that within 4 weeks we ought to have a much clearer sense of the relationship between vaccination and hospitalisation. And we shouldn't need another 4 weeks to get that. So I remain hopeful that by the time I stand here next time, I will have had advice of a sufficiently definitive sort for me to be able to say to people either, look, things are not looking good and we can't move ahead, or we're now pretty confident enough that vaccination has altered the relationship between illness and hospitalisation. And despite the fact that the numbers are rising, we can go ahead with some further moves to restore people's freedoms. So I'm hopeful that the evidence within the 4 weeks will be sufficiently strong for us to be clear about which path we're on, and that I don't end up coming here saying, oh, we're still waiting to find out what the evidence is telling us. I can't rule it out that that is what will happen, because we're all, even the most distinguished scientists who advise us, every one of us is having to learn as we go along here. But what I've been told, and as I say, what I see SAGE telling the UK government is that 4 weeks is enough for us to be clearer about the path we are on, and then to make decisions based on that evidence. Adam, diolch yn fawr. Over to Jez Hemming at the Local Democracy Reporting Service.
Good afternoon, First Minister. With the rise in the Delta virus, which we know is highly transmissible and has been circulating within younger age groups, are you considering restrictions on access to schools and colleges and introducing remote learning? And if not, why not?
No, we don't have at the moment any active plans to restrict learning. There are only a small number of weeks left in this school term. Schools are, because of everything we have learned together, very carefully run and organised to keep the virus at bay. Unlike in England, we haven't removed mask wearing in schools, despite the discomfort that I know that causes to people who have to wear them all day long. We have thousands of lateral flow tests being used every week now in schools to try to minimise disruption. And unfortunately, where it is necessary, we are having to send people home for self-isolation, and that number has risen in schools in Wales over the last couple of weeks. But current assessment is that is sufficient to allow schools to operate and colleges to safely for the remaining weeks of this term. And keeping children in education has been a top priority for this government in the last term and in this term too. So why not? Well, because we know of the strongly disadvantageous impact which further disruption to children's education will pose to them. So we continue to do everything to find ways of keeping our schools open and our children being offered the education that they need and which will stand them in the best stead as they go into the new autumn term.
Moving on, it seems there's been reports this morning of a spike in children being admitted to hospitals through emergency departments due to respiratory syncytial virus, RSV. Figures are 25 to 40% higher than normal have been reported in some areas. Are we seeing any similar rise in child admissions in Welsh hospitals, and specifically within North Wales?
Jez, I don't have specific figures about the number of children with those conditions who are turning up at A&E departments in Wales. What I do know is that the numbers attending A&E departments in Wales have risen sharply over the last couple of months. They're back to, and in some cases exceeding, the levels you would normally have expected at this time of year. And while I don't have the figures in front of me, I think in a common sense way, you would expect that general rise in numbers would include a rise in numbers amongst children as well. So you'll have seen the advice that senior clinicians have provided across the border that a visit to A&E should not be the first response to make when a child falls ill in that way. That advice through the 111 service, contacting the primary care service will be the first port of call. They will advise families if a visit to a hospital is necessary, but there may be many other ways that they can advise people to be able to respond properly to a child who has fallen ill in that way without needing the trauma of an A&E visit. Jess, thank you very much. I'll go to Will Hayward at Wales Online.
Thank you, First Minister. UK Health Secretary Matt Hancock has said that as soon as it's reasonable to do so, double vaccinated people who have been identified as a close contact of a positive case will no longer have to self-isolate for 10 days, will instead take daily tests to enable them to continue living their lives. Is this something that is being piloted or considered in Wales? And if so, do you have a time frame on which this could happen? And if not, what's the reason for not exploring this option? And are you able just to clarify on the modelling you mentioned for Swansea University? You mentioned 900 hospital admissions under a reasonable scenario. How many deaths was that?
I will see if I can find the figures for you as I'm going through my papers, Will. But in terms of whether double dose of vaccination could allow us to mitigate the need for people to self-isolate at home, we are involved in those conversations. I have fewer concerns about reducing the self-isolation period for double dose vaccination people than I do against the removal of quarantine for people returning from overseas, because overseas there is always the risk that people will be exposed to new variants of the disease, and I think the risks are higher in that case. We are, of course, keen to find ways to reduce the need for self-isolation for people in the domestic sense. So yes, we are involved in those discussions. We don't have pilots of it at the moment because they don't have pilots that I'm aware of elsewhere. But developing the case that would give us confidence that if you'd had a double dose of the vaccine, you could either reduce or alter the regime of people in a domestic sense who currently need to self-isolate, I think is something we would be keen to try to make progress on. And I have found the figure for you. In the most likely scenario, the Swansea modelling says 900 admissions between June and the end of August and up to 200 deaths.
Okay, thank you very much. In recent days in Scotland, about 2/3 of cases in the 15 to 44 age range have been male. Some experts have suggested that this could be down to the football being on. Have we seen any similar data in Wales at the moment? And what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, the rise amongst the younger age population is as pronounced in Wales as it is elsewhere. And part of the reason why we think, obviously vaccination rates are lower, so that is playing its part, but social mixing is greater, and that is playing its part as well. And you know, I've read some of that explanation from Scotland, partly linked to the football, partly a more general explanation that young men are more likely to be out and about and, you know, in greater number of social contacts and therefore at greater risk. While I have seen the figures of the general rise, I've not seen it broken down by gender here in Wales, but I guess you might not be surprised to find that the same things that are driving some of those behaviours in Scotland would also be found here in Wales.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to Will. Over to Shane Brennan at the National.
Well, when are children going to get vaccinated and how will that be rolled out?
Well, children in Wales will be vaccinated if that is the advice of the JCVI. So the JCVI, the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation, which has given us advice right through the pandemic, was hoping to have given its advice to us by now, has delayed that advice on the vaccination of children to the end of the month because they wanted further information on the risks of the vaccine to that younger population and on the ethical case for vaccination. If the JCVI recommends that children should be vaccinated in Wales, we now have plans in from every health board in Wales as to how they would do that, the mechanisms they would use, the relationship between that and flu vaccination in schools in the autumn. And we're confident that if the JCVI says go ahead, we'll be ready to do it in Wales. But we wait for their advice and we won't have it now until the end of this month.
In light of the different approaches that the pandemic has highlighted as a result of devolution, what does UK government support for the One Britain, One Nation scheme say about the State of the Union?
I am in favour of the United Kingdom. I think there is a strong case to be made for it. For me, it doesn't rest on flag waving and song singing. And my dispute with the United Kingdom government is not about the end. I want to see the case for the United Kingdom made strongly. The way they go about it, I'm afraid, minimises the real case and tries to rely on a sort of, as I say, a flag-waving approach to it all, which simply doesn't work. As I read the other day, this week's fiasco about song singing in schools did have the effect of uniting the United Kingdom, but it was with people laughing at the absurdity of that idea. Shane, diolch yn fawr. Over to Rob Taylor at Wrexham.com.
Good afternoon. Flintshire has the highest case rate and cases in Wales, and the local council have expressed obvious concern. And to use a specific example, they've asked for lateral flow tests to be used as a fun fair is taking place this weekend, although the fun fair is fine under current Welsh rules. Are you considering activating localised measures that you've used before at similar benchmarks? And if not, does that indicate your confidence of the impact of vaccinations?
Well, Rob, I remain of the view that as far as we can, it is better to have single systems in place across the whole of Wales. Does that mean that we have ruled out using localised measures, particularly when those local players, the local IMTs, the local authorities and so on, think that that would be advantageous? No, we haven't. And the use of lateral flow devices is a new part of our armoury. We are using enhanced levels of community testing in some parts of Wales already, and we are doing other things that have a local impact. But I want to be led by the advice we get from those local players, and as much as possible to continue with the All Wales approach, and vaccination, of course, is a very important part of that.
Thank you. And I think you mentioned 15 people have been admitted to hospital in Wales with Delta. In England, data on the split between admissions of those unvaccinated, first doses and second doses and so on is published, and in fact was published yesterday in the Technical Advisory Cell update, and there's been another update this morning from Public Health England. Do you have that information for those admitted in Wales, and will that information be regularly published?
That data is available for internal management purposes. I think if the numbers rise in the extent that they have in England, then it will become safe to publish that data in Wales, as you know, and I know you and I have discussed it a number of times over the last 15 months. When numbers are very low, there is a risk that people can be identified individually by the data, and the people here who are data experts advise us not to publish it when that could be the case. If you got to the stage where we had numbers of the sort in England, that objection to publication would diminish, and we are keen to publish wherever we can. Rob, thank you. Over to Elliot Worthing at That's TV South Wales.
Gyda'r, First Minister. Wales fans already in mainland Europe are being refused entry into the Netherlands for the last 16 game against Denmark tomorrow. Should the government have offered these fans more support, considering they were always going to travel despite their advice?
I think that would have been a pretty contradictory position for the Welsh Government to have adopted. Our advice, as I've said earlier, has been clear for weeks and weeks that we think people shouldn't travel. And I think it would be difficult for us to say, on the one hand, don't travel, and on the other hand, but here's a set of handy hints that you can use to do what we're advising you not to do. So on the whole, I think it would have been a difficult strategy for us to have followed.
And cases of the Delta variant seem to be highest in places that are traditionally populous tourist destinations. Will you therefore not reconsider your position to place restrictions on the border with England to those travelling from COVID hotspots?
Well, I don't think that was ever a practical strategy in relation to the third wave of the Delta. And it's certainly not a practical course to be followed now, because the Delta variant is everywhere in Wales. And even if not a single person crossed the border for the next few weeks, the virus is already here. So even when there was a stronger case, we didn't think we could make it work in a practical way, because how would you know in a practical sense as a police officer on the border whether someone was coming from a high prevalence area in England or for somewhere where the Delta variant had not yet reached? So even in those circumstances, it wasn't something we felt we could implement, and now it really would not make any difference. So we've got no plans to do that. Elliot, thank you. And finally, for today, Tom Magner at Carers World Live.
Thank you very much indeed, First Minister. No one seems to be mentioning shielding anymore, despite the apparent growth of the Delta variant. There are people with immunosuppressed conditions who can't be vaccinated, and significant numbers of people are being cared for with complex needs. What do you advise the vulnerable to do now? That's unpaid carers of all ages, cautious people who still very much fear accidentally bringing home the virus, a fear, they say, because others in the community appear to be too complacent.
Well, I think my main advice to them would be to return to the last letter they received from the Chief Medical Officer, who set out the things that people ought to think about for themselves now that shielding was no longer something we were asking people to do. it's always been clear in Wales that the fact that we're not asking people to shield doesn't mean that those people who understand that in their own circumstances they still need to have a higher level of personal behavioural ways of protecting themselves wouldn't be necessary. And the Chief Medical Officer's letter set that out in some detail, and I think it remains the best advice. I do understand why people who have underlying health vulnerabilities are concerned sometimes when they see the way in which some people are behaving as though the virus no longer existed. You know, and my advice to them is very strongly, coronavirus has not gone away. Your risk personally in every part of Wales is higher today than it has been for many weeks past. And observing all those things that keep you safe and help to keep other people who are maybe more vulnerable than you are safe are as important today as they have been at any point in this pandemic.
Thank you for that reassurance. Can I take the situation into a sharper focus, and that's the workplace? I'm hearing of unpaid carers being bullied into returning to work in offices without any assurance that other workers will respect mask wearing and distancing, and the employer in those cases doesn't seem to be supporting them. So can employers work sympathetically with unpaid carers?
Well, of course, employers should do exactly that. And, you know, employer organisations in Wales, I think, are very clear with their members that a return to the workplace has to be very carefully risk assessed on the one hand, that it should be volunteer-led as well, and that all the safeguards that you would expect to see to protect people in the workplace need to be there and published so that that local workforce can see the actions that have been taken. And that will mean that people will be more confident in coming back to the workplace, and employer organisations, I think, in Wales very strongly recognise that that is in the interest of the employer. You know, workplaces where people are confident to return are better workplaces, and you get more out of the workforce. Places where people feel under pressure to return or aren't confident that all the things that are in place are not places where people are likely to be able to give of their best. So, this is absolutely in the interests of employers as well as employees. And in Wales, we continue to have many of those obligations in the regulations. They're legal requirements, they're not just advice. The whole business of conducting risk assessments, publishing them, making sure things are in place, it's an obligation on the employer, and good and sensible employers understand that they're there to help them too. Tom, diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much indeed.